Ordering games are one of the easier types of LSAT logic games on average. And one of the things that typically indicates an ordering game is that you have a sequence of variables that are being ranked or are occurring over a period of time. Oftentimes, none of them are occurring simultaneously, and that is your indication that they must be ordered because nothing is happening at the same time. They'll often involve placing variables in specific slots and telling you that they cannot be in other slots. They often involve variables occurring consecutively or being adjacent to each other, or not being consecutive and not being adjacent to each other. They'll often involve placing spaces between variables and telling you that certain variables must come before or after other variables. So keywords are before, after, sequences in order, chronologies involving time or numbers, rankings, days of the week. Those are all typically associated with ordering games. In harder games, they might involve some elements of this, but also involved other things as well. But on average, if you see these keywords, you see these concepts, you're often going to be dealing with an ordering game. Here are some examples of typical ordering game rules, variables being before or after each other versus being immediately before or immediately after each other. Again, that idea of being adjacent or being consecutive. You'll often have variables being related to the first or last space as well. There's two types of ordering games. You have relative ordering games, which involve just loosely relating variables to each other. This is often known as relative ordering or relative sequencing or pure sequencing, lots of different names, all the same thing. Here's an example of what a diagram for relative ordering might look like. I have an example of a logic game that I've created that is of this type, linked below this video. On the other hand, you have strict ordering games, which involve placing variables in relation to specific slots on a diagram. And here's an example of what that might look like. So you see here we have 7 slots and we're inserting variables onto specific slots. Again, I have an example of a game like this one linked below this video if you'd like to check that out and see what that looks like in practice. Grouping selection games, also known as in and out games, are one of the relatively harder game types that give students a lot of trouble. Here, we are choosing or picking some variables but not others from a list. These games often involve conditional rules, conditional reasoning, such that if we have one variable, then we do not have another variable, or if we lack a variable, then we must have another. So a lot of these games come down to the difference between having a positive variable, then a negative variable, versus a negative arrow positive. And I have some links to articles below this video relevant to this game type and these concepts if you'd like to find out more. Now, common tasks these games involve: which variables must be selected or chosen to be in, which cannot be selected, chosen to be out, which variables require that others be chosen or not be chosen, and which variables being out require other variables to be chosen or not to be chosen. A lot there. It seems more abstract than it is. Real examples will make this more palatable and understandable for you. So again, links below this video with all the details on those concepts. Now, ultimately, our task is to determine which are chosen and which are not from the total set of variables. So here we have an example of what a diagram for a grouping selection game could look like. This is from a game that I created. There's a link to it below this video. Here we have, if G is in, then E must be out. So G requires not E. Positive variable requires a negative variable, and it's contrapositive. If E is in, then G must be out. So positive followed by negative, at least one of G and E must be out. On the contrary, we have a negative variable E followed by a positive variable J. So if E is out, then J must be in. Contrapositive, if J is out, then E must be in. So the J-E relationship establishes at least one variable in and the G-E relationship establishes at least one of G and E must be out. Now, I walk through the full setup for this game in the link below this video, but again, this is an example of what a fairly complicated in and out game diagram might look like. There are simpler games, there are more complex games, all within the selection category, and these are essential to understand. I cannot emphasize this enough. These games have come up again and again over the course of LSAT history. You have the classic Birds in the Forest game, Test 33 Game 2. You have the Photograph game, Test 45 Game 3. You have 58 Game 2 with the Volunteers. It goes on and on and on. So master this game type or else you're leaving points on the table. Again, lots of links to various articles and games illustrating these concepts below this video. Check them out. Can't emphasize it enough. Master this game type. Grouping splitting games have a lot in common with grouping in-out selection games because both game types involve dividing variables into two groups. For an in-out game, the groups are in and out. For splitting games, they're perhaps group 1 and group 2, group A and group B, and both game types involve lots of conditional logic. If one variable is in one place, then where does the other variable go? So we have if group 1, then group 2, or if not group 2, then not group 1, and of course variations on each of those. Again, same ideas, which variables must be together, what cannot be together, what can be in one group, what must be in one group, what cannot be in one group, and how do those variables relate to each other, of course. Our job for this game type is simply to determine which variables will be in one group and which will be in the other group. And here I have an example for you of what a grouping splitting game diagram might look like. Notice here that I'm using subscripts. We have if G sub H requires D sub J, then what would the contrapositive of that be? Well, if there are only two groups, let's say they're H and J, and D were not in J, what would that be? Well, if D were not in J, then D would be in H. And if G were not in H, then G would be in J. So the contrapositive of what's happening with G and D on the top diagram is what is happening with D and G on the bottom diagram. I really just included this diagram as an example, but couldn't help walking through it a little bit. I have a link to the full game and my explanation of how to solve it and how to draw this diagram linked below this video if you'd like to see the full setup and walkthrough for what a grouping splitting game might look like in practice. Grouping splitting games are not the most common game type, certainly. They're still a really important game type to master because they hinge a lot on conditionality and on your ability to take contrapositives and thoroughly understand them. So don't miss this often neglected game type. It is important, and if you want to master logic games, you've got to be able to do grouping splitting games as well. Grouping matching games involve associating variables of one type with the variables of another type, but we're not putting anything in order. There's no ordering component to this game. We're often simply grouping all the variables we have listed into different categories. So here you see some examples of what those rules might look like. What variables could be together, what cannot be together, what must be together. Those are all the different sorts of things that we're playing with here. Here's an example of what a grouping matching diagram might look like. You see here that we have the variables A, B, J, and P being placed on top of the 7 variables listed across the bottom. It's not as if G is earlier than V. We're simply spreading them out in order to better distinguish them and associate the variables A, B, J, P, those 4, with the 7 different variables of the other category below. Now, to make this a little more real and relatable for yourself, I would suggest checking out the link to a grouping matching game below this video in order to walk through what the setup for this game might look like.